Now, to discuss this further, we're joined by Angela Quintal, who is the Africa Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Angela, thanks for your time. I know you've had quite a hectic day. Thanks for making time to speak to us. Just off that report that my colleague Sharon Bryce Peace had filed, he talks about 100 journalists that have been killed in the line of duty last year. How much of that figure does Africa account for?
Look, Africa accounted for 5, but may I just say that figure, methodologies are different. So for the Committee to Protect Journalists, we actually have 59 journalists who have died in the line of duty. It's a case of saying that if a journalist is murdered in reprisal for their work, or if they're caught in crossfire, those are the sort of things that we would look at. We certainly wouldn't include if a journalist happened to be in a car accident, or wasn't on duty and happened to be in the bank and someone shot them. That wouldn't count, and that's why you have different figures, right? So for us, it's in the 50s, but as I always say, one journalist killed is one journalist too many.
Let's talk about the continent and how we're faring in terms of press freedom. And I speak about this on the backdrop of a statement that you've also released pertaining to the situation in Uganda on some of the journalists being targeted for their reports on, Bobby Wine. So talk to us a bit about that. What are we seeing on the African continent to date with regard to press freedom? How are we faring?
Look, it's mixed. So you have some bright spots on the continent. Let's look at Ethiopia. 2 years ago, Ethiopia had the second highest number of journalists in jail in sub-Saharan Africa. As we sit today with a new leader there, we've got no journalists. Same as with Gambia. Gambia was a country under Yahya Jammeh where journalists were murdered, where they were thrown in jail, where newspapers were closed. Under Adama Barrow, there's a new vibrancy in the media there. But then you look elsewhere on the continent. You mentioned Uganda. It remains a problem, but other countries as well. So if I can just give you an example, Eritrea continues to be the worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa, with 18 journalists behind bars. And then you have Cameroon. Cameroon is now the second highest jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have your bright spots, but you also have journalists who are being arrested willy-nilly. I mean, you just have to look at our neighbour in Mozambique, where we had a journalist called Amadi Abubakar in detention without trial for 107 days, and under international pressure, finally, he was able to be freed on bail, but still faces charges.
I want to bring it a bit back home. South Africa has its own fair share of incidents that we can look at and really raise our eyebrows at. For example, governments still do not seem to have a comfortable relationship with the media. I don't think that they should. But you've had incidents in South Africa where you've had a journalist, Peter Myburgh, who's been attacked for his book Gangster State. You've had some unsavory comments that have been made between a journalist as well as the governing party's Deputy Secretary General. How would you say South Africa is faring? In a democratic dispensation like ours, we enjoy media freedom, but you still pick up incidents where journalists are seemingly unable to do their work.
Sure. So, I mean, there's just no comparison in terms of journalists in a democratic South Africa. We do have press freedom. We are in a position to write things about our leaders without finding, the police at our door and throwing us in jail. But we have a new concern, and it's beyond government interference necessarily in the media, but what we're looking at is that social media space where journalists are being harassed online, are being intimidated, are threatened with rape, are threatened with murder. Mostly women journalists, I might add. And what you then have is you have self-censorship, and especially in South Africa, where you've seen it's prominent women journalists that are being targeted. Think of the knock-on effect. Younger journalists are looking at this and saying, well, if Ferrell Hafaji is targeted, if Ranjeni is targeted, Karima Brown, what about me? And that is problematical. And one of the things that one really needs to do is to find how are we going to stop that? Because it is not fair that women who should be on that platform are effectively silenced and their voices aren't heard. And that is a huge, huge, huge concern for the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Yeah. I want to talk perhaps about the other side of the coin. In an earlier interview that some of my colleagues did with Sanif, they acknowledge, for example, that you have this mistrust between the public and journalists. Look, we've made our own fair share of mistakes within the South African media. We've seen apologies that have been made in some of the prominent newspapers in the country. And how do we mend that relationship? There's no justification, of course, for the kinds of attacks that we've seen against any of these journalists, and I might sound biased when I say that, but it certainly is disconcerting, it's uncomfortable. But how do we mend that relationship then by looking at ourselves and also saying that where we err, we should be able to fix, so that we can once again fix that element of mistrust between media and the public?
Sure. So look, journalists aren't angels. But I think what the public needs to understand is that when we talk about media freedom, this isn't an issue about journalists alone. This really is about the public's right to know, the public's access to information. And it is a contested space. And in this day and age where you have social media, you're also looking at disinformation, where you have politicians and others who are trying to undermine the credibility of journalists with disinformation, right? And so they're sending the wrong message out there to the public who might not necessarily understand that the journalist who is actually doing the work is actually doing this for the greater good, for the public's right to know. And the politician who is saying false news and the journalist is this, that and the other, in all likelihood has something to hide. So that's the one thing. But there's a major, major problem in terms of the disconnect between journalists and communities.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the great problem. In newsrooms, you have, and we all say this time and time again, you have a juniorized newsroom. You have journalists who are not out in the field anymore, are doing telephone journalism. So they're not seen, they're unable to interact, and I think that is possibly one of the great regrets that we in South Africa have not been able to move from our desks in newsrooms to the extent that we should be out there with the people, as may have been previously, even before apartheid, when you would be able to go into a protest area and as a journalist you were not seen as the enemy. Now you cover a service delivery protest and the community turns on you. And I think a lot of, media literacy, I think people need to understand at the end of the day that no, the journalist is not the enemy. More than likely, the people who have something to hide are the ones that are targeting journalists.
So would you say that then that is the new threat to media freedom? I'm speaking on the issue of disinformation, where attacks, you've got social media where it's very easy for people to hide behind a computer and just attack you and your credibility because they're not happy with what you're writing or what you're saying. Is that the new threat?
That's definitely a new threat. We see it in South Africa, we see it elsewhere in the world. But other threats are also still there. So you do have, certainly in the continent, the rest of the continent, governments who are obviously going to arrest journalists because they feel that journalists are giving the wrong information to the public. The public needs to know certain things which the governments would necessarily want to stop. So that's still a problem. Another threat to media freedom is our own industry. You know, I mean, the fact that we have denuded our newsrooms of talented people, that we don't have mentors in newsrooms anymore. So mistakes are going to happen, and that's going to affect credibility. So first and foremost, I think South African media, as other media, we need to do a bit of navel gazing and look at how we are able to ensure that we claw back that credibility, because that credibility is lost. Let me just say one other thing. The Afrobarometer survey that came out 2 days ago about how the public across the continent looks at media freedom was very depressing reading, because for the first time, the public is saying that media freedom is not important, that governments can actually go ahead and curtail those freedoms, and that is of major concern. And we need to work, as journalists, we need to work at that.
Angela, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I really wanted to ask you as well what your involvement is in the issue, but the ongoing issue of a local journalist, South African journalist, who's still in captivity in Syria. What is your involvement at the moment? Some disturbing pictures, obviously, had emerged just a few days ago. A video that has surfaced that shows a sign of life. But what is your involvement, just very quickly, on that particular aspect?
So my colleagues in the Middle East and North Africa program are very involved, coordinated with others, trying to ensure that we actually get to know where he is and then look at how we're going to get him out. And so with the Gift of the Givers and others, we're working with them.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much for coming through. That was the Africa Programme Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, Angela Quintal. Thank you very much for your time. Let's move